Everything you know about Neil Armstrong says he would not do this. The reluctant hero, the quiet professor in Ohio, the man who gave nothing away. Yet in July of 1976 he was in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in mud and guano and lamplight, being lowered on a rope into the dark with more than 100 soldiers, scientists, and cavers around him. They were down there for one reason: a man had claimed, on paper and under his own name, that thousands of metal books were hidden underground, each page stamped with symbols nobody could read. Armstrong's verdict was 7 words. You get them at the end. Cueva de los Tíos sits in Morona, Santiago province, on the eastern slope of the Andes, where the mountains break apart into Amazon rainforest. Its main entrance is not a mouth in a hillside. It is a hole in the jungle floor. You walk through dripping green, and the ground simply stops. Below that lip is a vertical shaft, most accounts put it at 63 to 65 meters. Roughly a 20-story drop, straight down into open air.
The cave is named for the birds that live inside it. Teos, oilbirds. Thousands of them nest on the ledges, they never see daylight, and they navigate the dark by clicking. Bats with feathers. Drop into that shaft and the sound reaches you before the floor does, a wall of screeching from something you cannot see. For generations, sure men climbed down on vine ladders once a year to take the young birds for their oil. In the dark. On purpose.
Inside, it opens up. Surveyors have mapped roughly 4.5 kilometers of passage down there, including one chamber around 90 meters wide and 240 long, a cathedral with no doors. In July 1976, more than 100 people went into it at the same time. British and Ecuadorian soldiers. Scientists from a dozen institutions. Professional cavers. A film crew. 2 governments paying the bill. And an honorary president whose name made no sense on that roster. Because in 1976, Neil Armstrong was not doing this sort of thing. He was 45. He had left NASA in 1971 for a teaching job, aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati, and then he essentially disappeared. He turned down endorsement money that would have made him rich. He stopped signing autographs when he learned they were being resold. Reporters called him the reluctant hero. The most recognized man on the planet had made a full-time career out of not appearing.
So when the letter arrived asking him to lend his name to a caving expedition in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the expected answer was no. It was always no. Instead he said yes, flew to Quito, and let himself be delivered into rainforest that floods every afternoon, a camp turned to quagmire, soldiers laying wooden walkways so people could cross to their own tents. And here is what makes it stranger. He did not just lend the name. The man who pulled all of this together was not an archaeologist, and not a government. Stan Hall was a Scottish civil engineer from Edinburgh who had read a paperback and could not let it go. So he started writing letters. Within about 18 months, his idea had grown into one of the largest cave expeditions ever mounted: joint special forces from Britain and Ecuador, the British Cave Research Association, more than 20 scientists, a dozen institutions, and the first man to walk on the moon. Think about what that takes. 2 national militaries. Helicopters. Public money, in a year when neither country had spare money lying around. Nobody signs off on that for a nice cave. They signed off because of one specific claim, precise enough that serious people decided the cheapest way to end the argument was to go down the hole and look with their own eyes. Wait until you hear what the claim actually was.
It did not start with an astronaut, or a bestseller, or a soldier. It started with one man, a notary, and a piece of paper filed in Ecuador in 1969, 7 years before anyone strapped on a harness. Everything that followed, including Armstrong hanging on a rope in the dark, traces back to that document. So set the cave aside for a minute and look at the Hungarian who said he had found something underneath the jungle. His name was János Móricz, Juan Móricz in Ecuador. Hungarian-born, Argentine citizen, a man who spent years in the Ecuadorian East chasing a theory that the ancestors of Europe's Magyars had come out of the Americas. In 1969 he went to the authorities with a formal, notarized declaration. He had located an artificial tunnel system containing metal objects, he said, and he wanted the state to protect his rights to the discovery. Not a campfire rumor. Paperwork, with his name on it. What he described was very specific. Underground halls with walls that looked polished. Passages with right angles, cut, not weathered. And in one chamber, shelves of yellowish metal holding what he called books. Thousands of them, each around 20 kilograms, each page stamped from one side with symbols nobody could read. He had seen it with his own eyes, he said. He would also reveal the location only under his conditions, and only to the right people. Then he waited. In 1973, the story went global. Erich von Däniken, the Swiss author of Chariots of the Gods, already selling millions of copies worldwide, published The Gold of the Gods. In it he wrote that Erich had led him through a hidden side entrance into that tunnel system, and that he had stood in front of a metal library, thousands of engraved plaques. He tied it to a Salesian priest in Cuenca, Father Carlo Crespi, whose collection of engraved metal sheets locals had been carrying to him for decades.
Then the German magazine Der Spiegel went to Erich. And Erich, the guide, the source, the man who supposedly walked him in, said this: Däniken was never in the caves, unless it was in a flying saucer. There had been no expedition. Only a long conversation. The photographs had been fiddled. Von Däniken later told Playboy that a writer who is not doing pure science is allowed some theatrical effects, and eventually conceded he had never been inside at all. But listen closely. Erich called the writer a liar. He never once took back his own claim. That is the situation the 1976 expedition dropped into. They were not chasing a Swiss bestseller. They were chasing the man the bestseller had borrowed from. 8 experienced British cavers rigged the main shaft and started pushing passages, sleeping underground, hauling gear through mud and guano and standing water. Above ground it rained until the camp dissolved. Below, they surveyed as they went, and every dead end got a number. Armstrong arrived late, near the end, when the ropes were already coming out.
He went down anyway. According to one of the cavers who was there, Armstrong was taken all the way to the sump, the flooded bottom of the system, the point past which nobody walks. And here is the coincidence nobody planned. On July 20, 1976, at 11:25 in the morning, a scientist on that team lifted pottery shards out of the cave floor. 7 years to the day since Apollo 11 touched down. And on that same date, back home, Viking 1 landed on Mars. As for the library, nothing. No shelves, no plaques, no yellow metal. What they did find were passages that look wrong for a cave. Sections with square-cut edges. Floors that read as level. One rectangular feature so door-like it earned a nickname, the Erich Portal. Geologists gave the boring answer: limestone fractures along straight joints, and water finishes the job. The cavers wrote that down. They also kept photographing the thing, which tells you something. The science came back rich. Something like 40 new species of bat, 100 new butterflies, 200 new beetles. And in the dark, human remains and artifacts, burials dated to roughly 1500 BC. That is the part that should have made headlines and did not. 3,500 years ago, people were getting themselves down a 63-meter shaft with vines and nerve, in absolute darkness, and they were bringing their dead with them. Nobody has fully explained why, and then the story just stopped. The expedition filed its report, no evidence of any metal library. The press wrote its one paragraph and moved on. Von Däniken kept selling books. Armstrong flew back to Ohio and, in a lifetime of not talking, this became one more thing he did not talk about. There is no interview where he explains why he got on that plane. 15 years later, Stan Hall found something that pried the whole thing back open. In 1991, Hall met an Ecuadorian named Petronio Jaramillo. Jaramillo said that in 1946, when he was 17, an uncle took him underground and he saw it, thousands of metal books on shelves, roughly 20 kilograms each, and beside them a second collection, transparent tablets laid out on trestles covered in gold leaf. He talked about the contents for hours, over 6 years of friendship, with one rule that never moved. He would not give the location. And then he said the thing that reframes 1976 completely.
It was not Cueva de los Teos. Different cave. A different site, tied to an island in a river. If Jaramillo was right, then the 100 soldiers, the 2 governments, the film crew and the man from the moon all rappelled into the wrong hole, and the real one was never touched. In May 1998, before he ever led anyone to it, Jaramillo was shot dead near his home in Esmeraldas. Erich had died in 1991. Hall died in 2008. The location went with all 3. Which brings us back to that line.
Stan Hall recorded what Armstrong said about the place, and it was 7 words, Teos is up there with the moon. The man who had stood in the sea of tranquility, who spent 4 decades refusing to romanticize anything, put a jungle hole in the same sentence as Apollo, and never expanded on it. The sure control access now, you need permission and a fee. The shaft is still there. Still black. Still full of birds nobody can see. So what do you think he saw down there? Tell me in the comments, and if this one got under your skin, like it and pass it to the friend who will lose a night to it. Hope you got something out of this. Hit subscribe for more in this lane, and we'll see you in the next one.